April 26th, 1945, Berlin, night. Although the concept of time of day no longer existed here, the sky above the city wasn't black. It was red from fires and artillery flashes. The Soviet troops are only a few blocks from the center. The city is surrounded. The ring shrank to the size of several streets and houses. No one enters. No one comes out. This is the end. And suddenly, in the middle of this storm, something impossible happens. A small two-seat Arado 96 aircraft appears in the sky above the burning city. He flies at the height of the roofs, diving between the surviving buildings to avoid radars. He is being shelled from all sides. The chances of survival in this plane were close to zero. It was like trying to ride a bike through the active Mount Etna volcano. But the pilot performs a miracle. The plane descends sharply and does not land at the airport. All airports have already been lost or destroyed. He sits on a makeshift runway right in the middle of Tiergarten Park, near the Brandenburg Gate and the Reichstag. A woman gets out of the cab. Her name is Hannah Reich. She is Germany's most famous test pilot, a living legend, a woman who tested the first jet fighters and even manned V-1 missiles. She flew to the most dangerous place on Earth for one purpose: get to the bunker and offer Hitler a way to escape. That moment, the April 26th landing at the Tiergarten, became the foundation for the most enduring conspiracy theory of the 20th century. The logic here is very simple. If Hannah Reich was able to fly to surrounded Berlin, then the air corridor was open. And if she was able to fly out of there 3 days later, and she did, then there was a way out of the cage. In the story we all learned at school, Hitler refused to evacuate, said goodbye to headquarters, and passed away in his office on April 30th. His body was taken out into the yard, doused with gasoline, and burned. The end of the war. The end of the Third Reich. But what if we look at it through the eyes of an investigator who doesn't believe the words and the official story? Decades after the war, the FBI declassified hundreds of pages of documents. In them, we see reports from agents from all over the world: Argentina, Colombia, Brazil. People swore they had seen him. Some claimed that he boarded a submarine. Others talked about a secret airfield in Denmark. Still others drew maps of a secret hideout in the Andes Mountains. Even Stalin at the Potsdam Conference, looking into Truman's eyes, said that Hitler was not dead, but had disappeared into Spain or Argentina. And all these theories come back to one fact: to Hannah Reich's plane, because her flight proved the technical possibility of escape. Over the next hour, we will do something that is rarely done in such investigations. We won't guess. We will test each of the 4 possible escape scenarios for durability. We'll load the fuel that wasn't there into the tanks. We will lay routes across the ocean, which has been seen through. We will examine the medical record of a man who could barely stand on his feet. We will answer the question of whether the most wanted man in history could have disappeared without a trace. And the answer will surprise you. But to understand why the door slammed shut, we need to go down to where it all ended, in a concrete box under the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Hannah Reich's plane flew away, leaving behind only the noise of the engines. But the bunker remained, and the walls in it were shifting by the hour. To understand why an escape was a logistical nightmare, we need to look at the map of Berlin in the final days of April 1945. But forget the maps that hung in your history classrooms. The empire that once stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga had now shrunk to the size of Central Park in New York City. By April 28th, the 1,000-year Reich was a strip of land a few miles long and a couple of hundred yards wide. This was Zone Z, the citadel, the government quarter. In the center of this tightening ring, 30 feet underground, lay the Führer bunker. Historians often describe it as a command center, but the survivors who were there used a different comparison. They called it a concrete submarine. The air was stale and humid. The ventilation system hummed constantly, trying to filter out the dust and smoke from the surface, but the smell of diesel, sweat, and fear permeated everything. The walls shook. Every few minutes, plaster rained down from the ceiling. That was Soviet artillery at work. The shells weren't falling somewhere far away. They were churning up the garden directly above their heads. The idea that Hitler could simply walk out of the bunker, put on a trench coat, and blend in with the refugees sounds plausible only in movies. In reality, the streets of Berlin had turned into a lunar landscape. Piles of rubble, 2 stories high, blocked the roads. Navigation was impossible. Moreover, the city was crawling with Soviet patrols and checkpoints. Any male of military age not wearing a uniform was immediately suspicious. Now, add to that the most recognizable profile in world history. A face that had been on every postage stamp, in every office, and on every square in Europe for the last 12 years. The chance of walking unnoticed for even 1 block was 0. But this is where, in this point of absolute hopelessness, the first great paradox is born. If the situation was so obvious, why did the world start talking about an escape at all? The answer lies in one of the most successful acts of disinformation of the 20th century. And the author of this script wasn't a Hollywood director or a Nazi propagandist. It was Joseph Stalin. When Soviet troops finally took the bunker, they found charred remains. Identification took time. But instead of immediately announcing to the world, "We found him. The war is over," Moscow began a strange game. Marshal Zhukov told reporters at a press conference, "We have not found the Führer's body." A little later, Stalin personally told U.S. Secretary of State James Burns that Hitler had possibly escaped to Japan on a submarine. Why? This was Cold War politics, starting before the Hot War had even ended. Stalin wanted to keep the Allies on edge. He wanted to justify the continued presence of Soviet troops in Eastern Europe with the necessity of hunting down Nazi criminals. This lie, launched by the Kremlin, fell on fertile ground. FBI and CIA, then OSS agents, began receiving thousands of tips from citizens. People saw Hitler everywhere. In a cafe in Washington, D.C., on a farm in Ohio, on a train in Brazil. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover personally demanded that every lead be checked. The files grew thicker, creating the illusion that where there's smoke, there must be fire. But let's go back to the bunker. While the world was building theories, the reality underground was much more mundane. In his final days, Hitler lost touch with reality, not figuratively, but literally. He was moving armies on a map that no longer existed. The famous scene from the movie Downfall, where he screams at his generals over Steiner's failed attack, is historically accurate. Steiner didn't attack because Steiner didn't have any men. Wenck didn't come to the rescue because Wenck's army was trying to save itself. By April 29th, it became clear. Land routes were cut off. The ring had closed. The only theoretical exit that was seriously discussed in the headquarters didn't involve a walk through the streets of Berlin. It involved a dash to another part of Germany, which the Americans believed had been turned into an impregnable fortress. To understand the first escape scenario, we need to briefly shift from the Berlin bunker to the Allied headquarters. In the spring of 1945, General Dwight Eisenhower had one headache that worried him even more than the assault on Berlin. In intelligence reports from the OSS, the term Alpenfestung kept appearing, the Alpine Redoubt. American intelligence seriously believed that the Nazis were preparing a massive withdrawal plan. According to these reports, the SS elite, top scientists, and the party hierarchy were to retreat to the Bavarian Alps. There, among the impenetrable peaks, a giant underground city had allegedly been built. Weapons factories, food stockpiles for years, bunkers connected by tunnels. The plan was to turn the war into an endless guerrilla meat grinder. This fear was so strong that Eisenhower actually halted the advance on Berlin, redirecting significant forces south towards Bavaria to cut off this route. But there was one problem. The Alpine Redoubt was Joseph Goebbels' greatest bluff. Yes, there were villas in the mountains, including the famous Eagle's Nest in Berchtesgaden. But no underground infrastructure for a prolonged war existed. When American soldiers from the 101st Airborne finally got there, they found wine cellars full of expensive French vintage, but they found no underground factories and no army of robots. It was a mirage. However, let's assume for a second that Hitler decided to break out towards it anyway. Not for strategy, but for survival. Let's look at the logistics of this journey. The distance from Berlin to Berchtesgaden is about 370 miles. In peacetime, in a Mercedes, this would take 6 or 7 hours on the Autobahn. But in late April 1945, Germany as a unified space no longer existed. The country was sliced in half. American and Soviet troops met at the Elbe River on April 25th. This meant that the land corridor to the south was effectively severed. Any convoy of cars trying to break through this seam would have to pass through a zone of active combat. But the main enemy wasn't the infantry. The main enemy was the sky. The Allies possessed total air superiority. American P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts were conducting what pilots called free hunts. They shot at anything that moved on the roads. A truck, a passenger car, a horse cart, any object became a target. The chances of Hitler's motorcade, consisting of heavy armored limousines, traveling 370 miles unnoticed under a clear spring sky, were absolute fantasy. And finally, fuel. By 1945, Germany had lost access to Romanian oil, and synthetic fuel plants had been bombed into oblivion by Allied strategic aviation. The Wehrmacht had stalled. Tanks were abandoned on roadsides, not because they broke down, but because the tanks were dry. Finding gasoline for an armored Mercedes that guzzles gallons of fuel in a destroyed country was a logistical problem with no solution. Hitler knew this. His generals knew this. The idea of breaking out to the Alpine Redoubt died before the first shot was fired in Berlin. The roads were blocked, the bridges blown, the sky swarming with hunters. The ground was sealed off. That left the only path that theoretically could still be open. The one Hannah Reich used. The sky. Let's go back to the Tiergarten. If you can't drive, perhaps you can fly. Switzerland was relatively close, and the Luftwaffe, it seemed, still had planes. But this is where the mathematics of the runway comes into play. Supporters of the escape theory have a seemingly ironclad argument. After all, Albert Speer, the architect of the Reich, had specifically modified Berlin's main thoroughfare, the east-west axis, into an improvised airstrip. He ordered centuries-old trees in the park to be cut down and lampposts removed to create a wide strip of asphalt right by the Brandenburg Gate. It was made for exactly these situations, and we know that Hannah Reich used it on April 28th. But the devil is in the details, or rather, in the dates. Hannah Reich flew out of Berlin late in the evening of April 28th. It was a kamikaze flight. Soviet searchlights caught her plane, and the anti-aircraft fire was so dense it felt like it was raining lead. She managed to break through, but what happened over the next 48 hours changed everything. By April 30th, the day of Hitler's alleged escape, the east-west axis was no longer a runway. It had turned into a shooting gallery. Soviet artillery had dialed in the range. Shells were hitting the asphalt every few seconds, leaving deep craters. Taking off in a transport plane, like a Junkers 52, which was necessary to carry Hitler and his entourage, requires a long, smooth run. Trying to lift a heavy machine off a strip covered in craters and shrapnel under direct mortar fire isn't bravery. It's a physical impossibility. The landing gear would simply snap on the first pothole. Nevertheless, history knows a man who claimed otherwise. And this brings us to one of the strangest episodes in this case. In 1947, at a trial in Warsaw, a former Luftwaffe captain named Peter Baumgart stood up and testified under oath, "I personally flew Hitler out of Berlin." The courtroom froze. Baumgart described in detail how he landed a plane on that very strip on April 28th, picked up the Führer and Eva Braun, and flew them to Denmark. Newspapers around the world picked up the sensation. It seemed like the smoking gun. But then psychiatrists began working with Baumgart. It turned out his story crumbled under the slightest scrutiny. Flight logs didn't match. Descriptions of the aircraft changed. Doctors ultimately diagnosed him as a pathological liar seeking fame, a man with serious mental disorders. He invented the whole thing from start to finish to avoid the hangman by feigning insanity, or simply to write himself into history. But the damage was done. Millions remembered the headline, not the retraction. But let's imagine for a second that Baumgart wasn't lying, or that another pilot managed to take off. Where would they fly? Popular theories name two destinations, Switzerland or General Franco's Spain. Spain is over 1,200 miles from Berlin. No German aircraft of that time, capable of landing on a short strip in the city center, had that kind of range. It would need refueling. Where? France was liberated. Southern Germany was occupied by Americans. Northern Italy was in the chaos of partisan uprisings. Landing to refuel meant immediate arrest. Switzerland was closer, about 400 miles. But by April 1945, the Swiss, fearing for their neutrality, were shooting down any foreign aircraft that violated their airspace. Furthermore, the skies over Europe were completely controlled by Allied radar. A lone plane flying from burning Berlin toward Zurich would be the perfect target for night fighter patrols like the Mosquito or the Black Widow. In 1945, there were no blind spots in the sky. It was the most guarded volume of air in human history. Slipping through it unnoticed was harder than walking through a wall. So, the ground is blocked. The sky is closed. That leaves the final element that has always beckoned fugitives: the ocean. The most romantic and technically complex theory leads us to the shores of South America. And so we arrive at the scenario that spawned hundreds of books, dozens of documentaries, and entire seasons of TV shows on the History Channel. The theory that Hitler didn't die in Berlin, but boarded a submarine and traveled to South America to live out his days on a ranch in Patagonia. And the scariest part of this theory is that it is partially based on truth. 2 months after the war ended, on July 10th, 1945, a German submarine, U-530, surfaced in the port of Mar del Plata in Argentina. The crew surrendered to the authorities, and a month later, on August 17th, U-977 appeared in the same place. This is a fact. 2 gray wolves actually crossed the Atlantic and reached Argentina well after Germany's surrender. And conspiracy theorists ask a logical question. If these guys could do it, why couldn't the Reich's most important passenger be on board one of them? To answer this question, we need to stop looking at a map and start looking at the dashboard of a 1945 submarine. The journey from northern Europe to Argentina is almost 7,000 nautical miles. In May 1945, the Atlantic Ocean was the most dangerous place on the planet for a German U-boat. The Battle of the Atlantic had been lost by the Germans back in '43. By the end of the war, the Allies had closed the so-called Mid-Atlantic Gap. Patrol aircraft like the Liberator and Sunderland flying boats, equipped with the latest centimetric radar, scanned the water surface 24 hours a day. The ocean was no longer a dark forest where you could hide. For German captains, it had become a transparent aquarium surrounded by cats. German submarines of that era weren't the nuclear subs from Cold War movies. They couldn't stay underwater for months. They needed to surface or use a snorkel, a tube for air intake, to run their diesel engines and charge their batteries. When a boat runs on a snorkel, it sounds like a tractor, and sonar operators can hear that noise for dozens of miles, and its speed drops to walking pace, 4 or 5 knots. Captain Heinz Schaefer of U-977 later described this crossing in his memoirs. It wasn't a luxury cruise. To avoid radar, they spent 66 days submerged, without fresh air. Imagine the atmosphere. Inside a steel tube, 200 feet long, there are 50 men. No showers. The temperature is near 100 degrees Fahrenheit due to the running machinery. The humidity is so high that condensation mixed with engine oil drips from the ceiling. The bread turned green with mold after 2 weeks. Clothes were rotting right off their bodies. The psychological pressure was monstrous. The crew was on the verge of mutiny. The idea that in these conditions, in the cramping, the stench, and the constant fear of death by depth charge, you could secretly transport a 56-year-old man with failing health, his wife, and an entourage, doesn't hold water. There was simply no room for a VIP cabin. Hitler would have had to sleep on a torpedo, just like the common sailors. Furthermore, interrogations of the crews revealed a simple truth. These guys weren't saving the Führer. They were saving their own skins. They were terrified of falling into Soviet captivity or returning to a destroyed Germany, so they decided to risk everything for a ghost of a chance at a new life in South America. No traces of Hitler or Nazi gold were found on board, just dirty laundry and empty tin cans. But even if we allowed for a miracle, even if a super sub invisible to radar existed, even if the ocean parted for it, there is one factor that cancels out all escape scenarios, both by air and by sea. We've been talking about the transport this whole time, but we forgot to talk about the passenger. Conspiracy theorists paint us an image of a cunning villain, full of vitality. But medical archives paint a very different picture. The man who descended into the bunker in 1945 was a physical wreck. When we imagine Hitler, our brain pulls up a clip from 1930s newsreels. An energetic orator gesturing wildly on a podium, a man holding stadiums in suspense. This is the image conspiracy theorists use when they say, he was smart enough and strong enough to fool everyone. But the man sitting in the bunker in April 45 had nothing in common with that orator. If you met him in the corridor, you would likely mistake him for a deeply elderly man. He was only 56, but biologically he looked 80. The secret of this rapid decay is kept in documents captured by American intelligence. These are the personal diaries and medical charts of his personal physician, Theodore Morell. Morell wasn't a traditional doctor. Within the inner circle, he was known as the Reich Minister of Injections. For years, he treated the dictator's hypochondria and fatigue with chemistry. The list of drugs that entered Hitler's veins daily reads like an evidence log from a drug raid. Pervitin. Today, we know this substance as methamphetamine. It was used to keep the Führer alert during night meetings. Eucadol. That's the brand name for oxycodone, the powerful opioid that has caused the modern addiction epidemic in the U.S. Cocaine. It was prescribed in the form of eye drops and throat lozenges, allegedly for pain relief, but the doses were such that they induced euphoria. Add to this injections of testosterone, extracts from bull prostates, and even strychnine, rat poison, which was used in microdoses as a cure for stomach gas. By 1945, Hitler wasn't just sick. He was an addict in the final stages of dependency, his body crumbling under a toxic cocktail of 74 different substances. Testimonies from officers in the bunker paint a pathetic picture. He had developed a severe tremor on the left side of his body. He constantly hid his left hand behind his back or pressed it against his thigh to hide the shaking, but it didn't help. He dragged one leg when he walked. His back was hunched. His skin had taken on a gray earthen tone, typical of people with severe liver toxicity. At the very moment conspiracy theories credit him with a daring escape, running across an airfield under fire or climbing down a rope ladder onto a submarine, he could barely dress himself. There is one detail that kills the action hero myth better than any document. Eyewitnesses recalled how, a few days before the end, Hitler tried to drink tea. He had to hold the saucer with both hands, and even then, the chattering of the cup against the glass was audible in the silence of the room. He would spill half of it before he could take a sip. Imagine this man climbing the Alps. Imagine him in the cramped conning tower of a submarine, needing to react instantly to crash dive alarms. It is impossible. His system was broken. Moreover, in the final days of April, the situation worsened. Berlin was surrounded, pharmacies destroyed, factories lost. Dr. Morell could no longer supply the medicine. Hitler began to suffer from classic withdrawal syndrome. His mood swings, from apathy to hysterical screaming, aren't just signs of stress from a lost war. They are a chemical storm in the brain of a man deprived of his habitual dose of opiates and stimulants. He couldn't run. He was a prisoner not only of the bunker, but of his own ruined body. The only thing he had strength for was to sit and wait. But what was he waiting for? There was no hope of victory. Only fear remained. And that fear took shape on April 29th, when news arrived over the radio from Italy. In the bunker, time wasn't measured in hours, but in news bulletins. And on April 29th, a report arrived that became the deciding factor. It was a radio broadcast from Italy. Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, the man who had been Hitler's mentor and Europe's first fascist dictator, had met his end. But it wasn't death that terrified the inhabitants of the bunker. It was what happened after. Mussolini and his mistress, Clara Petacci, were captured by partisans while trying to flee to Switzerland. They were executed. But the next day, their bodies were brought to Milan, to the Piazzale Loreto. What happened there was forever imprinted on Hitler's psyche. The bodies were dumped on the ground in front of an enraged mob. People who had feared the Duce just yesterday were now spitting on him. Later, the bodies were hung by their feet from the rafters of a gas station so that everyone could see the idols fall. Photographs of this event instantly circled the globe. When Hitler was told the details, witnesses say he went pale. He fell into a state of cold numbness. For him, this was worse than losing the war. This was his deepest, irrational nightmare. The fear of becoming, as he put it, an exhibit in a wax museum. The fear of turning into circus entertainment for the victors. Hitler saw himself as a figure of Wagnerian magnitude, a mythical hero, and the thought that his body might end up in a cage in the Moscow Zoo or at a fairground in New York was unbearable to him. Stalin wanted to put him in a cage and put him on trial. Hitler knew this. It was the news from Milan that put an end to any thoughts, even theoretical ones, of escape. Escape is a risk. The risk of being caught. The risk that you run out of gas somewhere in the woods and a patrol finds you. He couldn't afford even a 1% chance of that outcome. That same day, he began dictating his final orders. They were extremely specific and did not concern the fate of Germany. He no longer cared about Germany. They concerned the fate of his body. He called his adjutant, Otto Günsche, and gave him the most important order of his life. I do not want to be put on display. After my death, you must burn me. Burn me completely, so that nothing remains. He demanded guarantees. He wanted to know how much gasoline it would take to turn a human body into ash. He was told, about 200 liters, 50 gallons. And while soldiers in the bunker corridors were already cracking open schnapps, preparing for the end, Hitler's chauffeur, Erich Kempka, was busy siphoning gasoline from the surviving cars in the garage. Jerrycan after jerrycan. These are not the actions of a man planning a new life in Argentina. These are the actions of a man preparing his own funeral, obsessed with the idea of vanishing. But there was something else, something deeper than just fear. It was the twisted logic of his ideology, the all-or-nothing philosophy that did not allow for life after defeat. There is one thing often missed when discussing escape theories. We try to apply the logic of a normal person to a man whose psychology was fundamentally broken. A normal person wants to survive at any cost. A normal person thinks, I lost, I need to hide, change my name, start over somewhere quiet. But Adolf Hitler wasn't a normal person. He was a pathological narcissist of messianic scale. For him, there was no separation between himself and Germany. In his distorted reality, the phrase "Germany is Hitler and Hitler is Germany" wasn't a slogan, but a physical fact. If Germany dies, he has no right to live. Moreover, he believed that if the German people lost this war, it meant they were unworthy of their Führer. This sounds insane, but it is documented. Weeks before the end, he issued the so-called Nero Decree. He ordered the destruction of all infrastructure in Germany: bridges, dams, factories, power plants. He wanted the country turned into a wasteland. His logic was simple. If we lost, we must be destroyed so we don't fall to the enemy. The weak must die. A man with such a philosophy doesn't plan a cozy retirement on a ranch in Argentina. He plans Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, the final, tragic chord of a Wagner opera where the hero perishes in flames along with his world. The best proof that no rescue plan existed is the tragedy that played out in the adjacent room of the bunker. The tragedy of the Goebbels family. Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, moved into the bunker with his wife Magda and their 6 children. The oldest was 12, the youngest 4. If there was even the slightest corridor for escape, a rat line, a plane, a submarine, wouldn't they have tried to save at least the children? Goebbels had resources. He had money. But they didn't even try. Magda Goebbels wrote a farewell letter to her eldest son from a previous marriage. It contains a line that explains everything. The world that comes after the Führer and National Socialism is not worth living in. It was a collective cult suicide. On May 1st, Magda dressed the children in white, combed their hair, and with the help of an SS doctor, gave each one a cyanide capsule. She killed her own children not because they couldn't be saved physically. She killed them because ideologically she couldn't imagine their existence in a world without the swastika. Hitler thought the same way. Escape for him would be an admission of insignificance. Imagine him in Argentina, mustache shaved off, aging, hiding from every knock at the door, working as, say, a bookkeeper or a gardener. For his ego, that was a fate worse than death. Death in Berlin, in the uniform of the Supreme Commander, allowed him to preserve the myth. He remained the Führer until the final second. On the night of April 29th, he dictated his political testament. There isn't a word of remorse in it. Not a word about salvation. Only blame. He blamed the Jews, blamed the generals for betrayal, blamed the German people for weakness. He left this life completely convinced of his own righteousness. On April 30th, around 3:30 p.m., the shot rang out. But, as skeptics love to say, words are words. Where is the body? Soviet troops found only charred remains in a shell crater, visually unidentifiable. And this opens the door for the final question. How can we be 100% sure that the pile of ash and bone in the Chancellery Garden actually belonged to him? The answer to that question lay in a small wooden box in the Moscow archives for over 50 years. On May 5th, 1945, soldiers of the Soviet counterintelligence unit SMERSH, digging through a shell crater in the Chancellery Garden, hit something hard. It was 2 severely burned bodies, a male and a female. Visual identification was impossible. Fire and time had done their work. And this fact became the fuel for all conspiracy theories for the next 70 years. No body, no crime. If we didn't see the face, how can we be sure? The answer lies in the fact that each of us has a biological passport that is almost impossible to destroy with fire. Our teeth. Hitler's teeth were in terrible condition, just like his general health. He suffered from gum disease, abscesses, and bad breath. He had so many fillings, crowns, and bridges that his mouth was a complex engineering structure of gold and porcelain. It was a unique map. Finding another person with exactly the same set of dental work was as impossible as finding a person with the same fingerprint. Soviet agents found the assistant to Hitler's personal dentist, Katie Heiserman. They didn't show her the body. They asked her to draw a diagram of the Führer's teeth from memory. She described every bridge, every crown in detail, especially a very unusual bridge on the lower right jaw. When her drawing was superimposed over the jaw found in the pit, the match was perfect. 100%. But here starts the problem. The Soviet Union classified this data. The operation was codenamed Myth. Hitler's jaw was packed into a cigar box and taken to Moscow. It gathered dust in the secret archives of the KGB, and later the FSB, for decades. The world didn't see the proof. The world only heard rumors. And this allowed conspiracy theorists to say, the Russians made it all up. That continued until 2018. For the first time in history, Russian authorities allowed a team of independent international experts to analyze the remains. The group was led by renowned French pathologist Philippe Charlier. They weren't allowed to take fragments out, but they were allowed to use microscopes and take samples. What they found was published in a scientific journal and became the final nail in the coffin of all escape theories. First, the morphology of the teeth perfectly matched Hitler's X-rays taken in 1944 after the assassination attempt at the Wolf's Lair. There could be no mistake. Second, bluish deposits were found on the teeth. Chemical analysis showed that these were traces of a reaction between cyanide and the metal of the dentures. This confirmed the version that he had bitten into a poison capsule. Third, there were no traces of gunpowder in the mouth on the skull, which disproved the version of a shot in the mouth. The shot was fired into the temple or neck. Professor Charlier came out to the press and said a phrase that should have ended the debate once and for all. The teeth are authentic. There is no doubt. Our study proves that Hitler died in 1945. He didn't run to Argentina. He didn't hide on a base in Antarctica. His remains lie in a small box in a state archive. Everything else is a myth we invented for ourselves. But why? Why, even after such evidence, do millions of people continue to believe in the ghost convoy and life after death? Why do shows like Hunting Hitler get huge ratings? The answer lies not in history or forensics. The answer lies in us. We spent an hour analyzing maps, studying fuel consumption charts, and reading dental reports. The facts speak unequivocally. Adolf Hitler died in Berlin on April 30th, 1945. But even now, as you watch this video, somewhere on the internet, someone is typing a comment. You're lying. He died in Argentina in 1962. Why is this myth so resilient? Why, 80 years later, do we keep looking for gray wolves and secret bases? The answer is simple and uncomfortable. We want to believe in the escape because the alternative doesn't satisfy us. We are raised on movies and books where the main villain always has a plan B. Dr. Evil always escapes in a rescue pod. Moriarty always survives the fall down the waterfall. In our culture, great evil must be genius, cunning, and elusive. We find it hard to accept the fact that the man responsible for the worst catastrophe in human history, for the death of tens of millions of people, ended so pathetically. We want to see him as an evil genius who fooled the world. Because if he was just a sick, shaking addict who shot himself in a dirty basement, gripped by panic, that makes the history of World War II unbearably meaningless. We are terrified to realize that the monster wasn't a demon. He was just a human. A small, broken, physically frail human. Hannah Arendt called this the banality of evil. And there is nothing more banal than dying in a concrete box with a vial of poison in your teeth. Conspiracy theories give us a false sense of order. They say, evil was smart. Reality says, evil was pathetic. Fate played a cruel joke on Hitler, one that is perhaps worse than any trial. He wanted to be remembered as a demigod, or, at the very least, for his departure to be a legend. But today, On the spot where the entrance to the Führerbunker stood, there is no museum, no grand memorial, not even a black obelisk. There is an ordinary parking lot. Residents of Berlin park their Volkswagens and Toyotas every day right over the spot where his body was burned. Tourists walk past, not even noticing the unassuming sign. Children walk dogs on the grass under which the fate of the world was once decided. This is the real end. Not a secret life in a villa in Patagonia. And not a heroic death in battle. Oblivion beneath the wheels of the mundane. Hitler didn't escape. He did the thing he feared most. He turned into nothing. I think that is the most just sentence history could have passed.